Yeah, so we're halfway through the pod right now. I want to talk about the playoffs because in FFPC we're getting prepared for the playoffs. In other leagues we're not. What did you guys do a couple weeks back, maybe last week, to start preparing for the playoffs? Whether it's loading up on defenses, loading up on kickers, dropping dead weight, things like that. Like, what did you do specifically, you Dio? Because I know in our group chat we kind of talked about preparing for the playoffs a few weeks back. So what did you do to prepare?
Well, I mean, so there's two folds to it, and we kind of alluded to it a little bit ago. As far as when starting week 11, once you drop players, they're no longer able to be picked up. And you can kind of play that to your advantage to some extent. I started to drop dead weight, guys where I felt like I was never gonna play them, but I was holding on to them because I felt like they had the talent. If they ever got the opportunity, they could shine. I started dropping them. I started adding defenses here and there that I felt like I was looking at their schedule to kind of see who I wanted to play. And I know, and I didn't mention this, but once week 11 hit, even though you can't pick up players anymore, defenses and kickers you can still pick up.
Okay.
So you can drop all the defenses and kickers and pick them all you want, and all the way leading up to week 14, if you're in the playoffs, you'll still be able to add them, as you need. So I was just kind of playing around a little bit with my rosters, kind of adding and dropping players as needed. I wanted to make sure I had the proper depth, and by that I mean if I have a team that has like 6 running backs that could all start for me, I didn't feel like I needed to have 7, 8, 9 other guys be there. I wanted to kind of solidify the rest of my roster, whether that be, adding a second quarterback, regardless how good he is, just somebody I feel like has a post that'll play, or even tight ends or receivers. Because here's the thing, and I think Abby brings this up a lot, COVID can hit any moment, regardless of how your team looks, perfectly healthy. Right now, at this moment, certain guys that are fine, tomorrow we could wake up and we get a report from Schefter or Rappaport saying, such and such is enter COVID protocol, they're going to be out this week. Yeah. Like just out the blue. And at that point, you need to have some kind of substantial, what's the constellation plan or whatever I'm saying.
Backup plan.
Just some kind of backup plan to be able to say, okay, if this happens, I still have a chance. You don't want to be put in a situation where if something random like that happens, you just basically kill your roster.
Yeah.
Because you put in too much effort throughout this whole season to get where you are for this thing that's literally out of your control to just kill your team.
Yeah.
And I think that's a mistake a lot of people make. I call it high fragility type teams, where one or two things happen, they go from being a great looking team to dead in the water. And I don't want to do that. I want to be like, even if I don't look as great, I still look good enough to at least give myself a chance.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I like to prepare my teams.
One of the best things you can do, especially in your home leagues, I mean, obviously in high stake leagues, is, don't fall in love with players on your roster. Because one thing that you should be doing every week, and this is why waivers, especially for people who play high stakes, and there are tons of them out there, great players. This is why waivers is so grueling, is because what you should be doing, and I think what most of the really good high stake players do, is they look at their roster and they look at the entire waiver, waiver list, all players on waivers, and they sort by points, they sort by ownership percentage, and then they search out names of guys.
I even look at last, just to see what's the most recent thing they done did.
And so and they look at and they search for guys who they think may have a potential, and then you want to compare that with your roster. And if there is somebody on waivers who is better than someone on your roster, unless it's like a very rare situation where you absolutely need that depth.
Be like Frozen and let it go.
Let it go.
Just let it go.
And that's how
you got kids.
All day long.
Let it go.
Let it go.
Yeah. Every week that is the process, and every week that I do that, every week I do that. So that is why, in my home leagues right now, I have 90% Madison shares. I have 70% Pollard shares. Because at some point, certain teams get desperate and they got to drop certain players. I had a league last week where I was I think 7-3 at the time, or a couple of weeks ago, whenever it was, 7-3, and I had a decision to make. I could either forfeit that week, meaning not because if you don't play a defense, you forfeit in that league, or I would have to drop Tony, or it was either Tony Pollard or Madison. I looked at the league. I saw that 6 teams make the playoffs. I was like, I'm forfeiting this week. I'm not dropping these players, you know. And then I go back and I'm like, you know, I look at certain players and I had like Alex Collins 2 weeks ago, and I saw like a Alexander Madison. I dropped Alex Collins for Madison because I felt like if I needed someone to like really like win me weeks, and if something were to happen, like it was going to be Madison over Collins. And now what we've seen, you know, Collins kind of deteriorate. We see them add AP. So I'm constantly doing that. I'm constantly looking at what's the best way I can put my team in a position to win. But like if I see something on waivers that player is better than someone on my roster, I'm cutting them.
You made a good point as well earlier where you first started talking about these not to fall in love with players. I know a lot of fantasy people that I talk to, just like my friends that play fantasy football, they're so tied to their draft and who they drafted, and they feel like even if it doesn't hit immediately, if they hold on to their players long enough, eventually it'll pay off. So they just kind of just ride these players out, all season long, regardless of what's happening around them. And one thing, and I realized this, so I started playing fantasy back in 2010. First year I played, I've never told this story really, but I played with my Texas Southern University. My frat brothers there, they invited me to a league. I didn't know what I was doing. I love football, but I didn't know what I was doing. They invited me to the league, picking some random players up. I picked up Leon Washington because I thought he was real nice, so he was a back runner, but I was like, man, when he gets touchdown, he looks good. So the first couple weeks, I'm getting just blasted. And they're talking so much trash to me. So that whole season, I had to keep churning my roster all day long, churning. I didn't actually win in the league that year, but the team that I won the championship with were like receivers that are like wide receiver 4 or 5 on their teams. But because of injuries, that week 15 and 16, they were playing prominent roles. And what that made me realize is the way the atmosphere or the landscape looks in the beginning of the season, lots of times look totally different by the time it matters. So these guys that were shining in the beginning of the season probably look great, but you have to be able to adjust because if you can have these gems that can put up these massive points and win you leagues that literally weren't even drafted in August or September. And you can't ignore that because that's how you kind of get that edge. Don't get content. Keep like Abby saying, churning, looking at that waiver wire, finding these players. Like this week, again, I'm throwing in Breida in lineups. I'm throwing in Tevin Coleman in lineups. I got all these random guys. It's like, man, who are you? But bump it. Let's go out there. Let's do it. So
Josh Reynolds. I mean, like you.
Josh Reynolds,
and it was Cedric Wilson last week. You 100% right in. Like I think you brought up also a good point as far as like you draft these players and you keep waiting and you keep waiting and you keep waiting, and it's a fine line, and every situation is different. And the hardest part is figuring out where to draw that line. Because guess what? At some point, and this is like a secret when it comes to like, fantasy analysts and people who do rankings or people who like promote certain players, at some point, every player is going to hit. At some point, every player is going to have a good game, and then you're going to be able to put out, this is why I
told
drafted.
you.
This is why you should have drafted him. This is why I was so high on him. But guess what? If it took 6 to 7 weeks for that player to hit, and he had that one good game, and then maybe had a couple good, then that wasn't a hit,
right?
Because you had by that point. You had suffered through 3 or 4 weeks of potentially starting that player. You had suffered through 3 or 4 weeks of having this useless player on your bench. And then when he finally hit, how likely was it that you started that player? That's why I'm so big on
most likely on your bench.
On like how often are you starting players when they hit? Like what's the percentage of start? Like
That's a good point.
At the end of the year, we're going to look and see X player scored X amount of fantasy points, but how often did you start that player when he was valuable? So knowing when to like cut bait, it's a hard decision because you never know, because it could be someone like Waddle or one of these players that like really, or Elijah Moore is a better example where they really take off. Like
Juwan Jennings might be somebody that's going to hit this year that nobody was drafting. Nobody even probably knew him 3 weeks ago.
So and y'all know how I was on Juwan Johnson like
Oh yeah.
Juwan Johnson, like the Saints tight end, like at the very beginning of the year, I actually started him, almost across the board and got lucky. But I had to watch that game and realize, man, this guy's not getting a lot of touches.
Yeah.
He's not getting a lot of targets.
Yeah.
So I had it took one game of like, okay, let me see if they're gonna increase the roll a little bit. And then I was like, all right, I'm not starting him the second game. Third game, I was like, okay, let me not cut him. Let me see. And then by third game, I cut him.
Yeah.
And then the same thing with Troutman. We were super high on Troutman.
But Troutman was actually getting
But this
targets
is the thing.
now.
It was easy to cut bait on Troutman early on.
Mm-hmm.
And then what happened? As soon as we started seeing him getting targets, we started picking
Scoop
him
him
back up.
Yep.
So knowing when to cut bait, knowing when to start put these guys in the starting lineups, like that's really where you make.
Are you
money.
low key talking about Robbie Anderson and all this?
Actually, I was about to say that.
Honestly, I'm thinking about Robbie Anderson the whole time. Like, he's talking about Robbie Anderson.
Hey, I swear to God, I was about to say that. I was like, you know what?
Honestly was not. That's a complex situation.
He's gonna hit, dog.
I swear to God, it's coming. It's coming. They're on bye this week.
He's gonna
but
hit.
next week is Robbie's week, man. I'm telling you. Next week is Robbie's week.